tied to a bedpost and starved by a jealous mother-in-law. A cowboy cut the knots and gave her a loaded table. The rope was hemp, old stuff, frayed at the middle like somebody'd been working at it for days, which she had, I found out later. But whoever tied those knots knew what they were doing, because all her working at it hadn't done a thing except take skin off her wrists. I didn't go into that room looking for her. I want to be straight about that. I went in there because I was hired to fix a chimney flue and Cora Dellums. She was the one that ran the place, Dale Dellums' mother. She'd told me the upstairs was closed off, and I was to stay out of it. Which I would have, except I could smell smoke backing up through the second floor, and if the flue was bad enough, it'd take the whole house in the night. So I went up, not to pry, not to find trouble. I went up to do the job I'd been paid to do. The door at the end of the hall was latched from the outside. That was the first thing. A sliding bolt, heavy iron, the kind you put on a barn gate. I stood there looking at it for a good while. Then I slid it back and pushed the door open. The room smelled like something between a sick room and a root cellar. No window open. The one window they had was a small, high thing, and the wooden shutter on it was nailed shut. I could see the nails along the frame. The only light came in around the edges of it, thin strips of afternoon. She was sitting on the floor by the bed, not lying down, sitting with her back against the frame and her knees pulled up and her right hand tied by about 2 feet of rope to the lower bedpost. She'd pulled the mattress off onto the floor beside her, which was probably how she'd kept warm. There was a tin cup beside her, empty. She didn't make a sound when I came in. That was the part that stayed with me. A woman finds a stranger in her room, she makes some kind of sound, surprise or fear or anger or something. She didn't. She just looked at me. Her eyes were dark, careful. She was maybe 23, 24. Her hair had mostly come loose from whatever it had been pinned into. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone that was old enough to have gone yellow at the edges. I said, "Who did this to you?" She said, "What are you here for?" I said I was hired to look at the flue. She looked past me at the open door, the empty hallway, and then she looked back at me. "How long does she think you'll take?" I told her probably 2 hours, the way Cora Dellums figured it, but I could probably work it to 3. Something in her face changed then. Not relief, not quite. More like a person who'd been holding their breath for a very long time and just realized they might be able to let a little of it out. I went back down and got my knife. My name is Harlan Cree. I was 44 years old that September. I'd spent 11 years as a deputy out of Butte, and the 4 years before that riding for the territorial marshal, and before that I'd been a number of other things that don't bear much explaining. I'd been married once. She died in '81, fever. It was quick, but it wasn't easy. After that, I knocked around. Did repair work, day labor. I was good with my hands and I didn't ask for much and I didn't make trouble for people, and mostly they didn't make it for me. The Dellums place was 3 miles south of the Orton Creek Road. Good land. Dale Dellums had cattle, some horses, dry goods from what I understood he traded in town. I'd been told he was away, took a trading run down to Casper once a month, usually 3 or 4 days, and that Cora ran things when he was gone, which from what I'd seen she ran things when he was there too. I cut the rope. Just like that, she held her wrist out to me. I put my knife to it, 2 passes, and it was done. She didn't thank me right away. She sat for a moment rubbing her wrist with her other hand, and I watched the rope fall to the floor, and I thought about what kind of man leaves his wife in the care of a woman who'd do this. Then she stood up, and she was taller than I'd expected, and she said, "If you're going to help me all the way. Don't cut me loose and leave me here alone." I told her I wasn't planning to. Her name was Nora. Nora Dellums, born Nora Pratt from Cheyenne. She told me that while I looked at the flue, and yes, it was bad, I wasn't lying about that, and she stood in the kitchen doorway watching the yard through the screen. She didn't tell it all at once. It came in pieces, the way real things come. She'd come to the Dellums place 14 months ago. Dale had courted her in Cheyenne, presented himself as a straightforward man with solid land, and she'd believed him because there was nothing obvious to disbelieve. What she hadn't known, what nobody thought to tell her, was that his mother had been running that house alone for 9 years since Dale's father died, and that Cora Dellums had no intention of sharing it. "She started the week I arrived," Nora said. She said it plain. No performance in it, just the fact. The first month had been small things. Cora forgetting to wake her for meals, then letting her know later that the food had been put away. Cora giving her the heaviest chores and then criticizing the way she did them in front of Dale, who nodded along because it was easier. Cora moving things in the kitchen so she couldn't find them, and then looking at her like she was simple when she asked. Dale leaving for town more and more, staying longer each time, and Nora realizing slowly that it was because his mother had made the house a place he didn't want to be in either, which left Nora there alone with her. By spring it had gotten worse, meals withheld for days at a time on some invented reason. Nora's letters to her sister in Cheyenne going unanswered, which she only understood later was because Cora had been taking them before they went out. The bruise on her cheekbone, she told me without my asking, was from 6 weeks ago. She tried to leave, walked 3 miles toward the road, and Cora had come after her in the buckboard and Dale had been with her. The rope had started 2 weeks before I showed up. The reason given was that Nora had taken a horse without asking, which was not a crime and not even discourtesy. The horse had been standing idle, but it gave Cora the argument, and Dale had gone along with it, the way he went along with most things. By then, I think he'd understood that he was living in his mother's house, and he was always going to be living in his mother's house, and the easiest thing was to just let her have her way about everything. I listened to all of this while I worked. I didn't say much. I've never been a man who talks a great deal. What I do when I'm hearing something is I think about it, and what I was thinking about was the distance to town, the horse she'd tried to take, and the fact that Dale Dellums wasn't due back until Thursday. It was Tuesday. I said, "Have you eaten today?" She said, "Yesterday morning." I said, "Where does she keep the food?" Nora looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to cook in Cora Dellums's kitchen." I told her I was going to cook in the kitchen of the house where Nora Dellums lived, which was not the same thing. Something happened in her face right then that I didn't quite have words for. Not a smile, deeper than that, like something had shifted underneath. She showed me where things were. There was a good deal more in that larder than I'd expected. Salt pork and dried beans, a cured ham hanging in the back, potatoes, onions, a crock of lard, cornmeal, a tin of molasses. Whatever else Cora Dellums was, she kept a stocked house. I took out the ham, and I took out the beans that had been soaking in a pot, and I cut the ham into thick pieces, and I set the beans on the stove, and I sliced the last of a loaf of bread that was on the sideboard. Nora sat at the kitchen table. She'd washed her face and pinned her hair back, and she sat with her hands on the table watching me work. "She'll know," she said after a while. I told her I was counting on it. She was quiet for a moment. "She'll be back before dark." I told her that was fine. "You're not afraid of her?" I told her I'd been a deputy for 11 years, and before that I'd ridden for the territorial marshal, and that in all that time I'd never yet been afraid of a woman who tied her daughter-in-law to a bedpost. Nora looked at me steadily. "What about Dale?" And I thought about that, because Dale was the piece of it that was harder to read. Cora Dellums was a straightforward kind of problem. She was a bully and a tyrant, and she'd convinced herself she had the right to run another woman's life because it was her house and her son. People like that don't change when you argue with them. They change when someone bigger than them draws a line. Dale was different. Dale was a weak man who'd let a terrible thing happen, and the question with weak men is always whether there's anything in them to appeal to, or whether the weakness goes all the way down. I told Nora I didn't know about Dale yet, but I'd figure it out when I saw him. She nodded. She didn't push it. That was something I noticed about her. She didn't push things, didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. We were comfortable in that kitchen in a way that I hadn't been comfortable anywhere in a long time. The beans were done before Cora came back. I'd found a pot of last week's venison stew on the shelf and heated that too, and I'd set the table, plates, cups, silverware, bread on a board, and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot I'd made. And Nora and I were sitting at that table eating together when we heard the buckboard in the yard. I want to tell you about that moment. Nora with a fork in her hand, color back in her face from the warmth of the stove, eating the first real meal she'd had in 2 days. The table full, lamplight on everything. The sound of that buckboard outside, and Nora going still, and then looking at me across the table, just looking at me steadily to see what I was going to do. I took another bite of stew. I didn't look up. After a second, she did the same. The door came open hard. Cora Dellums was a big woman. She had the kind of presence that fills a room before she even speaks, which some people call authority and I call something else. She stood in the doorway looking at the two of us at her kitchen table, and the food on it, and the lamps I'd lit, and something went through her face that I'd seen before in people who are used to having their way. It was the thing that happens when they realize they've lost the room. She said, "What in the hell is this?" Not a question, a pronouncement. I looked up at her then. I put my fork down on my plate, nice and easy, and I looked at her and I said, "This is supper." She started talking then, a lot of it, about her house and her son and who I was to come in here and who did I think I was and who had let Nora out of that room. I listened to most of it. When she got to the part about who let Nora out of the room, I told her I had. She told me I had no right. I told her she had no right to tie a woman to a bedpost and starve her, and that what she was describing as rights and mine were two different things, and that from here on out things in this house were going to work differently until Dale came home and we could have a proper conversation. "You are a hired hand," she said. "You are a chimney man." I told her that was right, I was, and I'd been paid for a day's work and I'd done a day's work, and everything that happened after that was my own business, and I'd answer for it to whoever needed me to answer for it. She looked at Nora then, hard, the way she'd probably looked at her for 14 months. Nora didn't look away. That was when I understood that what Nora needed, more than a man to fight for her, more than someone to cut the rope, was to see that Cora Dellums could be stood up to. Because Cora had made herself seem enormous, made herself seem inevitable, the way those people do. And all it took was one person in the room who wasn't afraid of her, and suddenly she was just a heavy-set woman in a doorway who wasn't getting what she wanted. Nora looked at her and didn't look away, and I watched it happen. Cora slept that night in her room. Nora slept in hers, the real bedroom, hers and Dale's, not the room with the bedpost. I slept in the barn, which is where a hired man sleeps and which suited me fine. I've slept in worse. I lay there in the hay listening to the night sounds and thinking about what came next. In the morning I made breakfast. I'm going to keep saying that because it mattered. Every meal was a statement. I made eggs, and I made biscuits, and I made bacon from what I found in the smokehouse, and I set the table and called out, and Nora came down and we ate, and Cora did not come down at all, and we didn't mention her. Nora said, "You didn't have to stay." I told her I hadn't found a reason to leave yet. She looked at me over her coffee cup. "You could lose work over this. Word gets around about a man who makes trouble at somebody's place." I told her that was probably true, and I poured more coffee, and that was the end of that conversation. On Wednesday, I fixed a section of fence on the south side of the property that had been down for what looked like 2 months. Nobody asked me to. I just saw it needed doing, and I did it. Nora brought me water in the afternoon, walked it out to where I was working, and stood there a while watching me string wire. She didn't talk much. Occasionally, she'd hand me something, a tool, a staple, hold a post while I drove it. She was useful. She didn't pretend not to be. Cora ate in her room both days. She didn't speak to either of us. That was its own kind of answer. On Thursday afternoon, I heard the buckboard before I saw it, and I came out from behind the barn where I'd been splitting wood, and I watched Dale Dellums come up the road. He was a thin man, younger looking than I expected, with his mother's heavy jaw softened down to something less. He drove the buckboard into the yard, and he saw me, and his face did a series of things in about 2 seconds. He said, "Who are you?" I told him my name, and that I'd been hired by his mother to fix the flue, which I'd done, and that I'd stayed on a day extra because there was other work that needed doing. He looked past me toward the house, and then toward the barn, and then toward the house again in a way that told me he was accounting for people, checking who was where. He said, "Where's my wife?" I told him she was inside. He got down from the buckboard and he walked past me, and I let him. I kept splitting wood. I heard the door. I heard voices, Nora's first, then Dale's, then Cora's, which meant she'd come out of her room. I didn't try to hear what they said. It wasn't my business what they said. What happened next, that was what was my business. After about 20 minutes, the door opened, and Dale came back out. He came across the yard to where I was, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets looking at the woodpile. He said, "My mother says you've been eating her food and making yourself at home." I told him that was about right. He said, "And you cut Nora loose." I said I did. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "I didn't know she'd gone back to doing that." "Gone back," I said. He didn't answer that directly. He kicked at a piece of split wood with his boot. She did it once before Nora. There was a girl hired to help in the house. She left. I thought, he stopped. I thought telling her not to was enough. I put the axe down. I looked at him and I said, "Your wife has a bruise on her face that's 6 weeks old and she hadn't eaten in 2 days. I'm going to tell you plain. If I ride out of here and she ends up back in that room, I won't stay ridden out." He looked at me, his jaw was tight. I said, "I'm not telling you how to handle your mother. That's your business. But Nora is your wife, and she came out here on your word that she'd be safe, and she's not been safe, and that's your bill to pay." He didn't say anything for a long time. The wind came through the yard, moved some loose straw. Then he said, "What do you need to stay on?" I told him I didn't need much. Fair wages, a place to sleep, meals. I'd work hard. There was plenty of fence down, and the roof on the second outbuilding needed attention, and the chimney hadn't been the only thing off with the flue system. There was a section on the east side that would need relining before winter. He nodded slowly. He said, "And Nora?" I told him that was between him and her, and what I wanted was for her to be fed and free to move, and not living in fear in her own house. He said, It's not," he stopped, started again. "She's my wife." I told him I knew that. He looked at me a long time. There was something working in him, some understanding of what he was and what he hadn't been and what that had cost. It wasn't comfortable to watch, but it needed watching. He said, "All right." That was all, just all right. He went back into the house. I heard his voice in there for a good while, and then Cora's, sharp and escalating, and then Dale's again, steadier than I expected, and then Cora's, and then just Dale's, on, and then quiet. I don't know everything that was said. I don't need to. What I know is that, when Nora came out to the yard an hour before supper, she came out without looking over her shoulder. She walked like a woman who'd set something down. She came over to where I was finishing the last of the wood, and she stood there, and the evening light was coming flat and gold across the yard, the way it does in September in that country when the summers just let go, and she looked at me with those dark, careful eyes. She said, he told her if she does it again, he'll send her to his sister's place in Nebraska. I said that sounded like a start. She nodded. He asked me what I wanted to do. I waited. She said, I told him I wanted to stay. This is my home too. She said it quiet, like she was hearing herself say it out loud for the first time. But I told him things had to be different. I said that sounded right. She was quiet a moment, looking at the last of the wood I'd split, the neat rows of it against the barn wall. Then she said, he asked if you'd stay on. I told her I'd said I would. She looked at me, why? I thought about how to answer that. I've never been fast with words. I stood there turning it over, and what I finally said was, I had a place I was needed, and it had been a while since I'd had one of those. She held my gaze. You did more than fix a flu. I told her the flu needed fixing. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile and not quite not. She said, supper in an hour, and she turned and went back to the house. I watched her go. I want to tell you what that moment was. Not a romantic thing, not then, not yet, that came later, slowly, the right way. What it was something I hadn't felt in long enough that I'd nearly forgotten it was something a man could feel. Being needed, being the thing that held, being the person whose staying made a difference to someone whose presence changed what was possible for another person. I was 44 years old and I'd spent years drifting after my wife died, telling myself the drifting was fine, that I was a man who traveled light, that it was simpler without roots. And maybe it was simpler. Simpler isn't the same thing as good. The meal that night was the best I'd had since I didn't know when, and it wasn't because the food was anything special. It was salt pork and beans again, biscuits, some of the dried apple Nora had put into a pan with sugar and cinnamon and coffee. Cora sat at the table. She didn't talk. Neither did Dale much. Nora sat across from me and passed things without being asked and refilled my cup when it was low and didn't once look at her mother-in-law the way I'd seen her looking at her before, that small, braced look, waiting for the blow. She looked at ease in her own kitchen. I stayed the winter. I want to move carefully through this because I don't want to make it sound like something it wasn't. It was 4 months of hard work. Cora was still Cora. She didn't warm to me, never would, but Dale had drawn the line and she stayed inside it. Dale himself was around more, helped with the cattle some, and I think he was trying to figure out how to be different in his own house without knowing exactly how to do it. He was getting there. It was awkward and slow, but it was happening. What changed between me and Nora changed the way real things change, without you seeing it move. It started with meals. She cooked and I came in from the work and we'd sit and eat and talk about the ranch, about what needed doing, sometimes about other things, places, books she'd read, things she'd heard in town. She was sharp, sharper than she'd had any room to show while she'd been ground down under Cora's thumb. She had opinions about things and she didn't hold them back around me, which felt like something she was trying out, speaking plainly, saying what she thought, seeing if it was safe. It was safe. In November, there was a week of hard snow, the early kind that catches you. I was out breaking trail for the cattle, and I came in with my hands half frozen, and she took them in hers and held them. Just held them. Both her hands around both mine, and she bent her head down over them, and she breathed on them, and I stood there in the door of the barn and didn't say anything, and neither did she. That was the first real moment. That was when I knew. In December, 2 days before Christmas, she came to the barn where I was working by lamplight on a piece of harness, and she stood in the doorway and she said my name in a way she hadn't said it before. I put the harness down. She said, "I want you to know something." I waited. She said, "Before you came here, I had started to think there wasn't going to be any of this. Any life, any future. I thought this was just going to be what it was, and I was going to get smaller and smaller until there wasn't anything left." I said, "But it's not." She said, "No, and then because of you." I started to say something about how she would have found a way herself, which she probably would have, and she cut me off. She said, "Let me say it." I let her say it. "You walked into that room," she said, "and you cut that rope, and you cooked a meal in Cora Dellums's kitchen like you had every right in the world to be there, and you stayed." She stopped. "You stayed, Harlan." I told her I was comfortable. She laughed, surprised herself doing it. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes up fast and breaks open, and she put her hand over her mouth after, and her eyes were bright in the lamplight. Then she stepped forward and she put both her arms around me, just held on, her head against my chest. I put my arms around her and I held her back, and I could feel her breathing, feel it slow and settle. She said into my shirt, "Thank you." I told her she didn't owe me thanks. She said, "I know, that's not why I'm saying it." We stood there a while in the lamplight in the cold of the barn, and the horses moved in their stalls, and the wind moved outside, and the lamp flame moved in its glass. And I held her and she held me, and it was the most at home I'd felt in 4 years. It went on from there. I won't rush through it, it doesn't deserve to be rushed. The winter turned to spring and the spring to summer, and Dale and Nora had it out properly in February, all the things that'd been left unsaid, and it was hard going, but they came out the other side of it to somewhere more honest. Cora went to her daughter in Nebraska in March. Not forever, and it wasn't over between her and Dale, but she went, and the house breathed. In the spring, Nora asked me to stay on permanently. She asked me that, not Dale. She came to me herself. She said, "This ranch is mine too now. Dale and I talked about it, and I want you here not as a hired hand." She looked at me. "I want you to be the person you've been all winter. I want you to be here." "For real?" I told her I'd been thinking along those lines. She said, "You should have told me." I told her I was a slow-talking kind of man. "I know," she said. She was smiling. "I don't mind it." I married her in September. 1 year almost to the day from when I'd walked into that room with the nailed-up shutters and the rope and the tin cup on the floor. The preacher came out from town, and Dale stood up with us, and it was a small thing, 20 minutes, but it was right. After, Nora took my arm and we walked back toward the house, and the evening light came across the valley, the way it does in September in that country, flat and gold. And the hay was cut and drying in the fields, and the cattle were fat from summer grass. She leaned into me as we walked. She said, "I wrote my sister." I asked what she'd said. She said, "I told her I was all right, that I was better than all right, that I was living." That word's living. She'd said once she'd been getting smaller. I'd watched her get bigger instead through that year. Watched her take up the space she was owed. Watched her find out she was funny, that she could be hard when she needed to be, that she knew what she wanted and knew how to say so. She'd made the kitchen hers, the ranch hers, her own days hers. That hadn't had a thing to do with me, not really. I'd just cut the rope. But I'd cut the rope. And I'd stayed. I'm going to be an old man soon, if I'm not one already, depending on who you ask. I still work hard, not quite as hard as I did, but hard enough. The ranch is good. My hands are stiff in the cold, and my back tells me things it didn't used to tell me. And I drink my coffee standing up most mornings, because sitting down too long in the morning makes the first hour outside harder. Nora still brings me coffee. She still comes out to the barn and hands it to me without ceremony, the same way she handed me tools when I was fixing fence that first week. Like it's the most natural thing in the world. Like she's just there, and I'm just there, and that's all there is to it. And I take the cup, and my hands are around it, and I can feel the heat of it, and I look up at her. And she looks at me the way she looked at me across that table the night Cora came through the door. Like she knows what I am. Like that's exactly why she stayed.